So it is my pleasure to welcome everybody to Math 119-312. This is our last chance to have an in-person class, so we will take advantage of it. It is my pleasure to introduce my distinguished colleague and hopefully friend, Professor Crane, who will be talking to us about COVID and China.
Hi, great to be here with you today. People online as well. So I come from the political science department. I come at things from the view of politics. That's why I'm going to come at this question, China and COVID-19. My background is Chinese politics. So I want to run for about maybe a half hour, something like that, and then try to leave some time for your questions. Well, will we end at, what time do we end, Steve?
We end at 11:30.
11:30. Okay, I'll try to keep track of the time. Okay. Let me see if I can figure this out. I screwed it up. Okay. Help. There we are. How to advance? There, finally. Haha. Takes me a little while. I want to talk about four things today. Just quickly talk about the controversy over the question of the origin of the coronavirus in China. It's a major kind of issue right now. Talk about what I'll refer to as the early failure in the PRC, handling the COVID crisis, the later success, and then think a little bit about the fallout that way. Before I start, though, I'm just going to say up front that I'm going to be using the words China, and I'll be saying Chinese, and or the Chinese, and when I say that, when I say those words, I'm generally referring to the government of the People's Republic of China. I'm not referring to all Chinese people or all citizens of the PRC. And I feel I have to say this up front because, unfortunately, there has been sort of irresponsible use of rhetoric in ways that have led to harassment of people. And I think we just need to be careful with our language. So I want to focus in on the PRC government, not talking about, the larger connotations of those words. So let's talk about the origins. Wow, this has become even more controversial. You may have noticed just this morning an article in the New York Times talking about some of the controversies around the question of the origins of the coronavirus. This centers on the question of whether it's natural or man-made. My sense is at this point, that question remains unsettled. There's a couple of things we can say. I mean, the early story was that, it looked like the virus emerged in the seafood market in Wuhan. That's probably not the case. There was some question about pangolins, 4 pangolins. They got a bad rap here because it looked like they were some kind of intermediate host between bats and humans. But it seems now, stuff that I've been trying to follow, that likely not naturally occurring in penguins. I think as you wade into and you're confronted with arguments and assertions about origins, you'll notice, and again, this article today in the New York Times focused on Li Mengyan. She's a researcher from Hong Kong who had skepticism about how the PRC government was presenting the origins, and came up with a theory that it was man-made, maybe purposively made in some ways. Unfortunately, she fell into a highly politicized kind of context and process, which should make us very suspicious of those arguments. So I mention this because there's another Chinese woman who also is a skeptic. Her name is Alina Chan. She's from the Broad Institute, which we all know because we get tested by them every week, twice a week maybe. And she has been kind of following the unfolding arguments about origins, the science. And I think her stance is that the question of whether it's man-made or not, whether it came out of a lab, still hasn't really been falsified, right? The language of falsification in science. And I think that's an important kind of thing to keep in mind because lack of falsification is not the same as certainty of confirmation, right? She's not saying it was man-made. She's saying, well, we still don't know the balance of evidence between whether it was man-made or it's natural. And I think at this point, we need to suspend our kind of conclusions about that question because it's new, right? This is a novel coronavirus. It's new, the science is new, we're all just learning about it at this point. But there's been great efforts on both sides of this question to try to come to certainty about origins. And again, I'm finding it to be helpful to follow someone like Alina Chan, who essentially ignored the Li Mengyan and Steve Bannon. It was a plot by the Chinese communists to destroy America. I mean, it's gotten bad fast that way, but that doesn't mean there aren't good, sober, responsible analysts out there, and I think Alina Chen is one of them. One point to make here is that the way that the PRC government has handled this has actually made it more difficult in terms of establishing what the origins are. Because why? Because the PRC government has been controlling the flow of information, and it makes it difficult for us. They haven't let the WHO into Wuhan in months to kind of explore what the question of origins is, and that's a problem. That's clearly a problem. So that's going to get us on to our second point here. We think about the way in which the PRC failed early in the handling of the coronavirus issue. It's all about the suppression of information in public health communication. That was happening significantly in the PRC. The point I want to emphasize here, though, someone who studies Chinese politics, this is not a bug. This is a feature of the authoritarian political system of the PRC. So when we see, in this case, that there's a way that the state is manipulating information and suppressing information, we shouldn't say, oh, isn't that unusual? Because it's not unusual at all. That's the way the authoritarian government in the PRC rolls. And it's, like I said, it's systematic. In an authoritarian government, you have a lack of electoral legitimacy, right? The government cannot go to the voters and have an election to establish a legitimate transfer of power, which, as we can see, given our situation we're in now, can be fraught at times, right? But that's not the way that the political system in the PRC works. Instead, without elections, in order to gain legitimacy, they emphasize what we political scientists refer to as performance legitimacy. So famously, the PRC has been successful at economic growth in the past couple of decades. You can deliver the goods to people, and there's an implicit kind of, sometimes explicit kind of deal there that we'll provide you, the authoritarian government will provide you with material comfort, with improving material conditions, with social stability, with public health, those kinds of public goods, and you just forget about the democracy thing, okay? Leave power to us and we'll deliver the goods. We call that performance legitimacy. Public order and public health are a kind of performance in that way, right? So given that, there's a real impulse, there's a strong incentive to limit the circulation of bad news that might undermine performance legitimacy. You don't want because people feel like, oh, the state is not delivering for us, that could lead to trouble. That could lead to protests. That could lead to demonstrations. So again, this is a feature of the system. And this is especially true at the lower levels of administration, like the provincial authorities in Hubei, the province where Wuhan, the city is, where the COVID crisis started. Because as you're probably aware, a big part of this story was those provincial and municipal officials suppressing the information, tamping down. So again, this is not something out of the ordinary. Let me give you sort of the greatest hits of, if I can remember how to do the thing here. Oops. Someday I'm going to learn how to do technology.
You might have to just click on the page again.
The which again?
Just click on the right screen.
Oh. Okay. Oh, I see. Oh, there it is. Now it should. Okay. Great. We go back to SARS in 2003. It was a coronavirus. So as you're probably aware, I've imagined in the class you scraped up against this one, right? In this time, this is 17 years ago now, there was a suppression of information. They tried to sort of say, oh, there's no outbreak, it's okay, until they couldn't really suppress it anymore. I guess I'll give you the greatest hits of kind of PRC state suppressing information. In 2005, up in Heilongjiang province, there was a chemical spill into the Songhua River. And there's this massive kind of environmental disaster unfolding. And the local provincial officials are like, what? There was no chemical spill. What are you talking about, right? Because again, why? What's the motivation? The motivation is to try to like cover up bad news so they don't get in trouble with the guys up top of them, their superiors, so they can kind of maintain performance legitimacy. Oh, the Beichuan earthquake in Sichuan in 2008. A little difficult to hide an earthquake, right? So the issue here was, what happened was very tragic. It turned out in this region where there was this very powerful earthquake, schools were destroyed at a higher rate than any other kinds of structures. And it turned out that there was a sort of systemic corruption in building schools, where they would cut the cement with water and all this kind of major kind of corruption scandal there, which was suppressed. I mean, the parents who tried to bring this to light were arrested and they were harassed that way. But again, it fits into that pattern of the state repressing information. This was one of my favorite ones. The Wenzhou train crash of 2011. So you see, like, the PRC government is very proud of the high-speed rail network that it set up. So in 2011, when one of their trains flew off the trestle and killed multiple people here, bad news. So you see these diggers, the diggers around the train here. The local officials outside of Wenzhou pretty quickly brought in these diggers to literally try to bury the evidence of this train crash here. But I mean, the problem here was that local folks, had telephones. So suddenly, here in Williamstown, Massachusetts, I was watching, and like in real time, how local people were revealing the local officials trying to cover up and suppress this bad news here. And then finally, maybe you're more aware of this one, the Tianjin chemical plant. Massive explosion, kind of like what just happened in Beirut recently. Kind of, stockpiled chemicals, a side fire, boom. Similarly, the follow-up investigations, etc. The state steps in and controls that information. So we get to the coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2. There is a suppression of information there. The detention and interrogation of doctors and researchers very early on, in December, as this was first coming to public light. We had cases flooding into Wuhan hospitals, as we had conscientious doctors and researchers confronting the emerging public health crisis. And they start talking to each other on their telephone chats. Suddenly they're getting the knock on the door, and the police are calling them in for interrogation and warning them, be quiet. And of course, the most famous person here is Dr. Li Wenliang. He literally became the face of, again, the frontline doctors in Wuhan trying to respond conscientiously and being blocked by the state. Very early on, we had, again, these were provincial officials and closing the local Wuhan labs that were trying to test, trying to figure out what the virus was about. And obviously, this sounds highly suspicious, right? Like, why would they do that? Were they trying to cover up the fact that it was man-made in the Wuhan lab, Wuhan Institute of Virology lab there? Maybe, but again, remember, this is a pattern. It's just because they were repressing information in this case, we shouldn't draw special conclusions from that, because that's the nature of the system. They delayed the release of important epidemiological information. And in this case, the incentives for the local officials, local politicians, clamp down to suppress information was probably heightened beyond the usual kind of systemic kinds of incentives. Because why? Because provincial party meetings were coming up in January, the 11th to the 17th. And, they wanted, this is a big public thing. It's on television. We have the red flags, the banners, like that. They want to present as like, everything's good. See, we're delivering for you. We're delivering the goods, economic growth, public health, order. They don't want this story to creep in and blow up their political narrative there. So they had a heightened kind of incentive, as well as the Chinese Lunar New Year coming up on January 24th to January 30th. You probably know this is often characterized as the largest movement of people on Earth. Everybody goes home. You think Thanksgiving is big? No, nothing compared to Chinese New Year. Right? So, on the cusp of this.
Well, I'm just getting a few things started.
Biggest holiday of the year. People want to travel. So the authorities don't want to like disrupt that. Say like, oh, by the way, like what's happening to us now, right? You can't celebrate your holiday, right? That's a letdown. People are, so given the timing of the outbreak and given the general systemic incentives, it's kind of easy to understand the local officials. And as you again probably know, the governor of Hubei and the mayor of Wuhan have both been fired from their jobs. They've been sort of scapegoated on this, and I think they bear some responsibility. But in a way, they might not bear all responsibility because, again, it's bigger than them in terms of these systemic kinds of incentives. And there's Dr. Li Wenliang, who died of the virus later. So again, a very poignant kind of symbol of the problem, of the early problem in the PRC. But it's more complicated than that. Because why? Because there are limitations of how information can be controlled. While the regime has an interest in limiting information for political purposes, it also has an interest in encouraging the circulation, especially of scientific and technical information. Why? Because performance legitimacy requires economic growth. It requires economic innovation. It requires cutting-edge scientific research to come up with that next big thing that might be sort of the breakthrough for new kinds of economic activity. So, especially in the realm of something like biomedical research that way. So there are competing political imperatives. On the one hand, to suppress. On the other hand, to try to create an open, globally connected scientific research sector where information is flowing in and out to advance the best kind of science in the world. And the PRC definitely sees itself participating in that way. It definitely does participate in that way. So you'll notice these other contrary kinds of things happen. As early as December 31st, Chinese health officials are informing the WHO of a new SARS-like coronavirus. So in some ways, they're suppressing information, but they're also releasing information.
Correct.
We have the kind of famous New Year's Day telephone call between Dr. Robert Redfield of the US CDC and his counterpart in the PRC, where we hear later the story that the Chinese counterpart, the head of the Chinese CDC, is crying on the phone because kind of realizing the implications of what's happening that way. And then finally, on this January 8th or 9th, depending which side of the Pacific you're on, Chinese doctors post the genome sequence on publicly available genetic data repositories. They're still holding back certain epidemiological information, so for the researchers, but both things are happening at the same time.
So this just goes in, and then you don't worry about this. You're done.
The nature of the kinds of political incentives.
Plug it in, and it goes for 400
again,
degrees,
when you
20
step back
minutes.
and think about summing up this early phase and how information is circulated or not.
I do 22
It's
minutes.
a failure. Because ultimately, they did not, because of the suppression of information,
And then, boom,
not wanting
done.
to
Whoop.
lock down the city. They don't lock down Wuhan until January 23rd. You know, they start limiting transportation, both domestically and internationally. That had been taken a couple of weeks earlier. If someone like a Dr. Li Wenliang, you know, his information came out, you know, more fully, maybe more effective steps could have been taken earlier. You know, I think that's what we have to summarize. Whatever the complications are in terms of some information is flowing, some information is not. Overall, it's a failure. But I think when we look at the steps taken after, say, January 23rd, there are sort of elements of success here. Because when the PRC government goes in and wants to implement strong, shall we say, public health measures, they implement strong public health measures, right? So, you know, the lockdowns of Wuhan, but also other cities. I mean, millions and millions of people are subject to restrictions on their movements that way. And that's, again, that shutdown is much more, extensive than I think just about anywhere else in the world. Quarantine, I just want to call out one aspect of quarantine here. The PRC, they quickly, and again, a lot of this has to do with their prior experience with SARS in 2003. They had gone through this before, so they kind of knew what had to be done or what should be done from a public health point of view. And part of the quarantine here was like, if you popped up with a positive test, you didn't just go home where you might infect your family members. Instead, there would be these sort of hotels or other kinds of facilities created where you would go individually to quarantine away from your family for like 2 weeks to really try to separate out, because they found that there was the spread, you know, happened in small scale familial types of settings that way. And again, this could sound really repressive, and I think, yeah, it is repressive on the one hand. On the other hand, it turned out that it really did shut down the circulation of the virus. And then other kinds of steps like testing. You know, you may have heard, I mean, since more recently, there's been a little spike in cases in China as the rest of the world. So a couple of weeks ago, there was a few cases in Shandong province popped up. And whoop, government sweeps in, boom, tests like 3 million people in like 2 days or something. So state capacity there is oriented to this problem. State capacity is mobilized for this problem, and state capacity is used to respond to the problem. I want to point out, though, that it's not just the commands of the government, but voluntary compliance is also quite strong. And again, this probably has something to do with the prior kind of experience with SARS and other kinds of coronavirus or public health kinds of measures. So if the government says, you have to quarantine, you have to stay home, people are going to go, yeah, that's a drag, but you know, we've been through this before, you know, we're going to do that again. So it's not just, like I said, the authoritarian government. It's also a population that has experienced similar kinds of situations in the past, and there is an element of voluntary compliance. And that actually redounds to the government's benefit later, because I think, as we'll talk about in a moment, there's ways that the government is seen as having been capable in responding in the PRC, not out of the PRC, but in the PRC. So this is what we get, right? So here's, I just pulled this chart from the Financial Times chart. There's so many charts, so many different kind of measures of cases and deaths. So this is just confirmed new cases, or no, confirmed cumulative cases. I think it's, no, confirmed new cases over time. It's not logarithmic here. So you can see, boom. I've been studying Chinese politics for decades. I see the report of data like this. I'm immediately skeptical that they're probably not reporting all the cases. They're probably not reporting all the numbers. But even if they're reporting, you know, even if it's 10 times worse or something, or 5 times worse than what they're reporting, it still looks pretty good compared to a lot of countries in the world. So I think, however fishy some of the numbers might be, I think the underlying reality is that the lockdown, shutdown, quarantine, testing kinds of actions taken by the PRC government has knocked down the virus there more effectively than elsewhere. This is the deaths, cumulative deaths attributed to COVID-19. And I know you're aware of sort of the questions about how these numbers get formatted and formulated, but nonetheless, that's a hell of a gap there. So let me sum up by thinking a little bit about the fallout. So here we are now. It's November 2020. The world has been dealing with this for months now. The PRC seems to be coming out of it to some degree. And the three things to think about when we think about the fallout and what will be the effects going forward. I think the economic recovery is the most important thing. Because why? Because COVID created an economic crisis all around the world. It plunges us into economic recession. The United States is going to face a real problem after December 31st with our incapable government and the sort of cliff that we're staring at in terms of the end of unemployment insurance, etc. When you look at how the PRC has handled it in the economic recovery, people talk about a V-shaped recovery. Their last quarter was 4.9% growth, which is low for the PRC, but it's rebounding. I think there's a perception, popular perception in the PRC of a kind of recovery is happening. They're coming out of it. If you walk down the streets in Beijing or Shanghai right now, things are pretty much back to normal. People wear masks. But remember, people wear masks in China like regularly. So I teach in China in the summer times. And even in the summertime, get on the subway, and if someone has a cold, they know that, oh, let me wear a mask because I don't want to spread the cold and whatever. So that kind of behavior is, again, much more commonly accepted. But when you get out and about in Beijing and Shanghai now, there's a sense of recovery, a sense of like we're back, where of course we're facing school closures, whether the restaurants can be open or not. So it seems like the PRC is ahead of the curve in terms of economic recovery. The domestic political impact too, I think is, it's complicated because why? Because it's hard for us to get a good read on popular opinion in the PRC, obviously. You don't have the freedom just to wander around and say, like, what do you think of Xi Jinping's government? That doesn't really quite happen. But the government certainly itself is making a big deal about like, haha, we're recovered, see how good we are. See, this proves the superiority of our system of government. So there's a lot of that. And I think that can work to some degree. Because why? Because it can feed into a sense of pride, a sense of like, yeah, we did this, we came out of this together, we did the right thing. And drawing the comparison with the United States, which is done regularly in Chinese media, and again, you don't really have to inflate the comparison or deflate it in any way. Just a straight up comparison of what we're doing versus what they're doing feeds into a positive political narrative in the People's Republic of China that way. Globally, the PRC government has also tried to like leverage their strong later response to sort of kind of go out and say, see, aren't we great? Don't you love us, world? Because we are doing such a great job. Of course, the world also remembers the early failure. So the attempts to try to leverage the COVID response for kind of positive, in political science, soft power kind of benefit in the world doesn't work, it turns out. So this is an organization, the Pew Research Center. They do public opinion polling around the world. So this is asking us what percent say that such and such has done a good job with the coronavirus outbreak. So 73% of people say their own country did a good job, right? If we cut over to China, 61% of people, this is a sample of people across advanced industrial democracies, for the most part. 61% of people think China did a bad job. So whatever that later kind of success might have been, obviously the early failure, the authoritarian quality of the response, I think, is not really that powerful. Oh, but that last one, U.S. Oh no, China actually looks better than the U.S. in this global sample that way, which I guess is not terribly surprising. But still, there's more negative feeling towards China than positive on how they handled the coronavirus. Oh, you can break this down now. Now, part of this it gets complicated, right? Because coronavirus is not the only thing happening in the world. Coronavirus is not the only thing happening in foreign relations between China and a number of other countries. So when you look and say Canada thinks the Chinese response to coronavirus is bad, up to like 61%. What's that about? Well, there's other stuff. I imagine you don't keep up with Canadian-Chinese foreign policy. Maybe you do, because the PRC has been detaining 2 Canadian citizens for over 2 years now under very kind of suspect circumstances, which is really is a major issue in Canada. So there might be other factors here. But just go down the list here, right? Denmark's up there the highest. Oh, the highest are South Korea and Japan, countries in the region, who in some ways have also, especially South Korea, have been relatively successful in responding less authoritarian manner that way. When they look over at China, that early failure, which of course led to the spread out of China, South Korea was one of the first places to experience it after China. That way, South Koreans are not impressed with the PRC handling of the coronavirus thing here, right? And this is just general perceptions about China as well. So China's facing a kind of foreign policy problem with these 14 countries, European and East Asian countries, with pretty negative kind of perception these days. Again, it's not just coronavirus, but I think we can say the coronavirus, whatever the successes are of knocking down the virus in China, it's not translating to international influence. And I'll leave us with this slide. It's from a journal, Foreign Policy, an American journal that investigates international relations, foreign policy issues. This was in October 2020. China, that's that V-shaped recovery, which Donald Trump can only dream. Right? So when you make that comparison, whatever the Chinese, the PRC failings might have been, when you make that comparison with the United States might look worse in a number of ways, economically, and the ineptitude with the way that the federal government has responded in that way. So in some ways, I think from an American perspective, at the end of the day, you probably have to say the PRC has done a better job of responding to the COVID crisis than the United States. I imagine not everybody will agree with that, but I'm happy to take your questions now. We have like 15 whole minutes, I think. Did 11:30 we finish? 11:30. So questions here? Yes. Sure.
I had a question about if you did regard the 1-year-old virus man-made or naturally failure, how does that change the fallout of the economic recovery or the market of that?
So if I'm getting the question, the sort of debate about man-made versus natural, what effect does it have on the fallout?
Yeah, it makes your view of one way or another.
I think it probably plays in the sense that, I mean, if we learned anything in the past couple of years about the circulation of false information, it may be, depressingly, it may be that can have a certain kind of political effect. So the fact that you have the researcher from Hong Kong is in the United States being promoted by certain kinds of media outlets to get a story out. And again, the form that this argument takes, the most extreme form, is that this was a purposive release, that the PRC government planned the development of coronavirus and purposively put it out in the world to like weaken the world or something, which personally, I find that kind of ridiculous. But it doesn't matter what I think, right? When you put that information out in the world and it circulates, that can have a certain kind of political effect, whether people fully believe it or not, or whether it makes them believe with greater certainty than maybe would be justified that this was man-made. Because again, there's a way. I think the science is still unclear on this. I think the responsible position is to say, yeah, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But nuance is not something that has great political impact in the world, where false certainty, is that such a thing? Is there such a thing as false certainty? Yeah, I mean, be certain about something but be false about it. Probably has, and again, I think that's been a sad political lesson that we've learned in recent years. Was there a question here?
Oh, yeah, I was just wondering, so, like, do you think that there's a way to follow more of, like, there's lockdown and things like that, like having the lawyers drafting and drafting, like, the full government, and, like, could we have more things now, and we can do all the next discussions over, like, have more laws.
Could we?
Yeah.
So the question is, could we, looking at what appears to be certain aspects of success in the PRC, could we learn from that and implement them ourselves? I'd love to be able to say, yeah, sure, but clearly the United States is a different kind of political, cultural kind of context, and the politicization of the virus in the United States is a real problem. I mean, the fact that wearing a mask to be taken as some kind of political symbol is a trouble. I mean, in terms of responding effectively to a public health crisis. So no, I mean, the US and China are sufficiently different in their political systems. I mean, the good thing to mention is that we have a fully articulated and institutionalized system of rule of law to defend individual rights. That's a good thing, right? But does that justify irresponsibility in responding to public health crisis? I mean, that's a problem, because it seems like, again, given the politicization, it's too easy to push here towards a kind of rejection of reality of the crisis. Other questions here? Got anything up there, Professor?
So, one of the biggest questions we always have is, what is the cost-benefit analysis of the different policies?
Yeah.
And the tough thing to throw into the mix is the individual freedom and the choice to live your life the way you want.
Right.
And so, is this enough of a question?
Yeah, no, so in thinking about that calculus,
yeah,
right, it's not just a personal calculus.
right.
So John Stuart Mill was had the harm principle, right? So wearing a mask is all about the harm principle, right? Because it's not just about me, it's about me harming you. So whatever kind of calculus has to be, would have to also take into effect the broader kind of impact, right? So and I think we're learning this in the places that have experienced the crisis here, later. The upper Midwest now, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wisconsin, where there has been a strong argument, libertarian argument. But now there's a kind of later recognition of like, but there's a limit to that. So you have governors in those states, some of the governors now saying, no, we do have to have a mask mandate. Why? Because the cost is too great. So another thing too about the cost, what's the time frame of the cost? Do we know? We don't know. We don't know. It's a novel coronavirus. We don't know what the longer term health impacts are going to be. That way, maybe they'll be severe, maybe they won't. We don't know. So there's a kind of uncertainty that I think you just have to say, look, this is not going to be a sharp kind of calculation. There has to be an element of judgment, saying, well, this, the best interest here is to be a little bit safe, constrain our personal liberty, yes, which we do every day anyway, living in a civilized society. So just a little bit more constraint on personal liberty, because the cost could be really large.
The difference is when is it a mandatory constraint versus a voluntary?
Well, it seems that voluntary is not enough.
Right.
This is the governor of, was it Iowa or South Dakota, who was out the other day? Because, yes, it was South Dakota. The governor of North Dakota imposed a statewide mask mandate. The governor of South Dakota said, well, it's an individual thing. No, it's not an individual thing, because the harm principle means you don't know if you have it and are spreading it and harming other people. So you have to mask up. And this is a good contrast with the PRC, because here the institutionalization of rights is such that people will hold that ground and say, no, I'm not going to do it. When the PRC, they don't have this institutionalization of rights. They have an experience with a government that is regularly exhorting them to, moral responsibility, and sometimes in ways that are kind of absurd. But that sort of recognition and acceptance of, like, yeah, I need to limit my behavior in the interests of the other person, is more powerful, I think, there. And I think that's an effect of institutions. I want to emphasize that, because we get some sloppy kind of cultural assertions that happen. Institutions and historical experience.
Can you hear me?
On the topic of medical,
Hello?
we had a long speech to us about what medical ethics are like in the United States in terms of how you go about doing research.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any idea what medical ethics are like in China and what their search is like?
So, well, I think there's probably a stronger kind of utilitarian kind of thought. That is to say, if there could potentially be a large social benefit to certain kinds of research, then maybe it's okay to do that, versus whatever the individual or other kinds of ethical concerns. And the thing I'm thinking about, and maybe you're aware of this, was the cloning issue. So there was a doctor in Shenzhen, China, who used cloning technology, CRISPR, I guess it is. Is that cloning? That's CRISPR. To genetically manipulate embryos to try to remove the possibility for contracting AIDS, right? So the argument was that we should be able to use CRISPR technology on human embryos. Because what? Because the social benefit can be so big. Needless to say, when this became public in the United States, it was seen as a horrible violation of medical ethics because of the potential misuse of that kind of technology, and the fact that we don't have established regulations and even understandings of what the frontiers of that kind of research should responsibly be. So some combination between a strong kind of utilitarian kind of ethic and a kind of underdeveloped rule of law in this sort of area. This guy was able to do that thing. And would other kinds of research, be public? Yeah, maybe. So I think, again, in terms of institutions, in terms of legal system, in terms of a kind of prevailing kind of utilitarian kind of understanding. Questions from the chat? There we are. Yeah, right there.
Yeah, I was thinking about the Pew Research polls. I used one in the essay actually.
Oh, there we go. I'm sure it's excellent essay.
I don't know about that. But I was thinking of an opinion poll or something as politicized coronavirus.
Yeah. Well, that's probably true with any opinion polling, right? So, so you come in and you ask, and yes, so I think especially in this case, in a place like Canada, where there are generally high negatives towards China to begin with, you know, can you say, like, what do you think about the coronavirus? It's going to be shaped by other kinds of political factors. So I think we have to be careful. And maybe the best conclusion to draw is that the coronavirus is not some sort of magic bullet. That, like, you know, because if you compare the general negatives of China to the negatives on coronavirus, there's been some other polling of other countries around the world where China looks better. So Africa, the Middle East, some other parts of Asia, there might be a more generally positive attitude towards China, Chinese foreign policy, and thus maybe, you know, the coronavirus narrative might carry better there. So you probably have to, you know, look at different spots around the world and think about the relationship between general views towards China versus views on coronavirus.
Are you taking questions from the chat?
From the chat.
Interesting to see how information propagates in China. I wonder to what extent is the public discrediting of health officials and the spread of misinformation by politicians, as we've seen in the U.S., similar or different to the suppression of information in PCR?
No. So the United States and the PRC are quite different in this regard, right? So I can get up and I can look at all of you today and I can say Donald Trump is a jerk, right? Because that's my rights. I can engage in that kind of political debate in whatever manner I want. When I visit China, I do not get up publicly in any manner and say Xi Jinping is a jerk. Because why? Because whoop, that would be one of the things, especially a personal attack on the leader. Yeah, I would not be going back. I would be sent home immediately, and I would never get a visa again. And everybody knows that. So the general level of kind of political repression of speech and information is significantly higher in PRC than the United States. So I don't think you can really make a comparison.
Can you tell us your views of Winnie the Pooh?
My views of Winnie the Pooh. Why is he asking this? He's asking this because it was a meme. Professor Miller is so up with his memes here. So years ago, Obama went on a state visit, or maybe it was Xi Jinping came here, and they were walking across the lawn, and Obama was kind of thin, and Xi Jinping has a little pot, and someone took the picture of it, and they said, you know, this looks like Tigger and Winnie the Pooh. So they put up the Tigger, Winnie the Pooh walking next to each other. So Obama's like Tigger, Xi Jinping's like Winnie the Pooh, and then that went viral. And it becomes sort of, in some cases, if you want to make fun of Xi Jinping, you don't make fun of Xi Jinping. You just kind of mobilize the picture of Winnie the Pooh and say, but again, what does that mean? If that's a marker of the repression of information that way, because you can't be, you can't be explicit in your criticism. Yes, last question.
How much does the PRC really rely on get like a restriction on what people can actually say against the government?
So the restriction on speech might actually make the reliance on performance legitimacy even greater, right? Because why would you accept that? Why wouldn't you say no to that? I mean, Chinese people are very expressive, out on the street, they're talking about that. So why would they accept that? Well, they accept that because there's a structure of incentives and disincentives. They know if they do speak up, they could get in trouble. But it's not just that. They know if they accept the regime, go along, there's a fair chance that their material life will be better, in the near future, or the material lives of their children. And so that's sort of the bargain. So the real challenge to the PRC is declining growth rates, which have been happening in recent years. That's why the COVID crisis for China, the biggest problem could be this economic recovery. If that gets botched, and then people are feeling like, oh, you're repressing my freedom of speech and you're not delivering goods. That's when there could be trouble. Again, I don't think there's any imminent crisis to the PRC regime. I think it's very strong. I think people believe in it. I think nationalism gets mobilized. But performance legitimacy, if economic growth declines, that could be trouble.
Thank you again.
Thank you. I will say goodbye to everyone on screen.
And then everyone have a great Thanksgiving break.
Don't go anywhere.
You can go anywhere, you just can't go with anybody else.